Hello and welcome. It's 12 o'clock and it's the 11th day of October 2021. And yes, it's my face because somebody said need more face, less pictures, voice, numbers, YouTube. I don't fucking care. I am your tabletop role-playing guide, telling news, weather, and sports of the tabletop role-playing. Yeah. It's almost as if somebody ate my brain. Which brings us to today's topic, brains. Or more importantly, since I just got back from the hospital and got more blood drawn and another shot, which makes me think vaccines, which of course leads me to think about zombies. That's right, it's Spooktober, it's that time again. Time to talk about the spookiness. Now, the word zombie is very interesting because it refers to something that doesn't actually exist. Okay, there are lots of words that refer to things that don't actually exist, like elf. Elf is a word, but as far as we know, no else. So the word is unusual because there's no real, where did it come from? It just sort of happened. Now, the general belief for people who study things like words is that it comes from the Creole voodoo culture, which of course comes from the culture of the slaves that were brought over to America during the slave trade days, i.e. slavery bad, who were told that they couldn't worship their gods. They had to be converted to the Christian God. And the practice was that they had appropriated the teachings of the Christian God, the Christian missionaries, the Christian religion, into the religions they brought with them from Africa and Asia and all the other places that we got slaves, and sort of made a hodgepodge new religion. So if people came by who didn't know any better, they would perceive that the slaves were following Christianity. But the slaves sort of put their own taint on it, their own picture on it. They brought their stuff and they incorporated it into Catholicism. So we sort of had this combination of these multiple religions from multiple cultures all over the world, and Catholicism as it was at the time. And that became what voodoo sort of came out of. So most people associate the word zombie from the voodoo practice of raising the dead. Though actually it's not raising the dead. It's somehow associated with placing people in sort of a waking mindless state through a use of drugs and hypnosis and belief. And so this person is awake, but they are locked in their bodies and can only respond to outside stimulus. They are trapped in your own body syndrome. And there's some proof that there are drugs and toxins from certain frogs that do this, and that there's some proof that, just through hypnosis and the power of belief, people could be convinced that this was happening, but there's no actual proof of the dead rising. And it gets even more confusing because if you talk to historians and or practitioners of voodoo and the various incarnations of that aspect of culture, many of them will say, no, that's not our word, because again, it was appropriated from Christianity and the idea of Christ rising from the dead. And that sort of became appropriated into the practice of the dead rising. But the idea of the dead rising, again, is not new, and it doesn't come from them. If anything, it comes from Europeans. Because, believe it or not, the modern medicine practices are relatively new. It wasn't a long time ago that people believed the best way to cure a headache was to drill a hole in your head and let the demons out. And if you were sick, the best way to cure you was to put leeches on your body to drain the venomous toxins of the demons out of your body until you were better. Embalming, relatively new thing. Autopsies, extremely new thing. Waiting 3 days before you bury the body, that's a new thing. Why? Because in the old days, they didn't have the ability to bury bodies after 3 days. Usually, if somebody died, they would be buried the day of or the day after. Because bodies, when you have no place to store them, stink. And the ideas of let's open her up and see what killed her, relatively new. really relatively new. For centuries, you're dead. You're going in the ground. Unfortunately, there are several medical issues that can allow you to appear dead, including being in a coma. Also certain, just passing out, vegetative state. So there is documented proof that people were buried who were still alive and had to dig themselves out of graves. Thus, zombies. And if you don't believe me, well, there is factual proof. And in fact, you can still find graveyards, especially in the older parts of America, like the East Coast, and especially throughout Europe, where you will see graves with bells over them. And that was because they would bury people and put a bell with a rope down to the body. So in case they buried somebody who was still alive and they made a mistake, they could ring the bell and get dug up. In fact, they would pay people to watch over the grave, thus leading us to the practice of paid mourners. So again, where does the word come from? Because if you track it back to voodoo, voodoo tracks it back to Catholicism, but it also tracks back to the ideas of people being buried who weren't really dead and crawling out of their graves. So the word is weird because it doesn't really come from any place. It's just sort of this amalgamation of this idea that the dead can rise. Now, in terms of movies, the definition of a zombie does not apply to the creatures that we see in zombie movies. If anything, the creatures in zombie movies are ghouls. Because as bare bone, the definition of zombie is magically animated corpse. No viruses are involved, and the idea that they must feast on the living, well, that's not from zombies, that's from something else. Partially vampirism, and partially just because that's the, cannibals, and partially just because there was cultures that people didn't understand. So there's this sort of this underlying fear/fascination of being bit, being eaten. It's a very, it's a very invasive, threatening personal space intrusion idea. Somebody's biting you. Somebody's eating you. That's like the worst thing you can do, to watch somebody eat you. That's got to be one of the most frightening things, and there's nothing you can do about it. But again, the definition of zombie is magically animated corpse. So the things in the movies like, Walking Dead that feasts on the living aren't zombies. They are by definition ghouls, because the definition of ghouls are things that supposedly lived under graveyards and fed off the bodies of the undead. Now, where does that idea come from? Most likely from grave robbers or rats. Is there any proof that people ate the dead? There is documentation of cannibals, but usually the people were alive, and then, any eating was done either right after they died or very soon. Because, if you put a body in the ground, it starts decomposing almost, within the first day. And that you don't want to eat that, because we just become this toxic bag of toxic gases. Why would you want to eat that? After like 24 hours, we're just a disgusting mass of gross disease. Blech. We're completely unhealthy, almost undigestible. Human flesh is definitely, considered, one of the worst things for you to eat. So where did the idea come from? Rats and other animals nibbling at bodies, because the idea of a coffin is also relatively new. Bodies were usually just thrown into a grave. If you were lucky, you were wrapped in burlap sack. If you weren't lucky, your body was just thrown into a shallow grave. The idea of a 6-foot deep grave, or, again, relatively new. Bodies were usually shallow. Thus, you have multiple stories of bodies being dug up from storms and streams and floating down hills because of the shallow graves. Bury them in a shallow grave is a term. Bury him in a coffin? You couldn't afford a coffin unless you were well off. If you're at a potter's field, a John Doe, bam, in the ground. If you're lucky, you get wrapped in a burlap sack. Now, add to that the process of grave robbing. Individuals who would, for various means, come to a graveyard and go after the personal artifacts that were left on the body, and later on actually start stealing bodies to give to medical practices. Thus the idea of the resurrectionist. So you bury a body, somebody digs it up, cuts off its hand, and then somebody sees that, and you cut off the hand because it got all bloated. You can't get the ring off, so you just cut the hand off and take it, and then get the ring off later. It's because you don't want to get caught. So you start seeing these images of bodies coming back to the surface with parts missing, or bodies being nibbled on by rats. Somebody's eating the dead. And we move forward to Hollywood, where we have the George Romero, which is, many believe, the first appearance of the idea in zombie in films, though there are some that say there actually was another film before that where Romero got the idea, a Brazilian film. And why he chose the word zombie? Well, he never says the word zombie. In fact, very rarely is the word zombie used in zombie films. We call them zombies, but the individuals in the films rarely do, unless it's more modern films. So the idea of Romero had these dead bodies rising from the grave because of reasons, and they feasted on the living. Why? Because already this implanted idea of that, plus it was just the most frightening thing he could think of, is to watch somebody eat somebody you love and you can't do anything. That's just so disturbing. So that's how it started. But those aren't zombies. They're ghouls, because the definition of ghoul is something that feasts on the dead, or recently dead, or even the living. Cannibal, ghoul. You eat the flesh of the living, you eat the flesh of the dead, and then the magic virus bypasses you to the next target, and that one rises, which is also a relatively new concept, pretty much from the movies. As for the brains thing, that's just sort of a meme that came out of one movie, and it just sort of became a regularly occurring meme in zombie films, that zombies feast on the brains of the living. But no, really, the ghouls are just eating whatever they can get. And why do we use the living? Because the living attacking and eating somebody else alive is incredibly disturbing and incredibly frightening and incredibly visceral and incredibly personal. It's just, that's why it works on so many levels. But really, human beings are horrible carriers of disease vectors, which is why we are usually secondary or third tertiary carriers of viruses. What is the number one carrier of diseases? Insects and birds. Why? Because we are not practical. We're horribly designed to get a virus spread quickly as possible to as many targets as possible. Insects and birds, on the other hand, are extremely adapted to spreading disease. But there's nothing frightening about watching an insect sting a person and that person fall down in a couple days because they got sick. That's not a movie. That's a National Geographic documentary on malaria. But a guy biting another guy, chewing up that guy's arm, and then that guy rising up and then going to eat another guy, that's scary. And that sells. And that's why we call them zombies. Because that's a word that is just sort of ingrained in our collective unconscious. And you say the word zombie, you have an instant image in your head. You don't even have to have ever seen a zombie movie. You just sort of know what it is because it's just so ingrained in our collective unconsciousness. Even though the things in the movies are zombies, they're ghouls, and the word doesn't really mean what we think it means. And as for the origins of the word, no one's really sure where it came from or what the first zombie movie was, though most agree it's Romero's, but there's some that say no, there was another movie before that. And at no point in time in Romero's film are they called zombies. They're called The Walking Dead. So yeah, zombies. There you go, a little education for you. If you appreciate that, let me know. If you don't, let me know. If I'm wrong, let me know, so I can correct it in the next video, when we'll probably talk about the other number one topic of horror and role-playing, that Lovecraft guy. Till then, brains.